Hello and welcome back to the Christian review of the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. This will be my 7th video in Chapter 2 and my last video in Chapter 2. Only 8 more chapters to go. You may have noticed that throughout this chapter I've been agreeing with quite a lot, just coming at it from a different angle and coming to different conclusions. This is going to continue in this last section, in which Dawkins takes on NOMA. Now what is NOMA, you may ask? NOMA stands for Non-Overlapping Magisteriums, which is a term coined by Stephen J. Gould to argue that science and religion do not overlap in any way and cannot comment on one another. To introduce this concept, Dawkins quotes Gould, saying, "To say it for all my colleagues and for the umpteenth millionth time, from college bull sessions to learned treatises, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. We simply can't comment on it as scientists." So Dawkins comments, despite the confident, almost bullying tone of Gould's assertion, what actually is the justification for it? Why shouldn't we comment on God as scientists? And why isn't Russell's teapot, or the flying spaghetti monster, equally immune from scientific skepticism? As I shall argue in a moment, a universe with a creative superintendent would be a very different kind of universe from one without. Why is that not a scientific matter? Now, as I said, in a way, Dawkins is right here. There's no reason why science and religion cannot overlap. But what I think Dawkins fails to realize is that it's a two-way street. It's not just scientists evaluating religion. God gets to evaluate what science says. So for example, scientists would now typically say that the human race is the product of a long process of evolution, of non-complex organisms gradually giving birth to more complex organisms until we finally arrive at humanity. God says different. God says, "Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." Now who's right? Well, Dawkins would say the scientists, because they're using science. But the fact is that no matter how smart these scientists are, no matter how hard they try to get it right to use a scientific method, they're humans and they're fallible. And they weren't there. God was. God knows what he did and how he created it. Now, of course, Dawkins will say that this means that the Bible couldn't have been written by God, and that this proves that it was a book written by men who did not understand science. But that's not actually logical. It assumes that we have arrived at an ultimate moment of scientific progress, and that we can be so confident in these conclusions that we can judge ultimate metaphysical questions based on these conclusions. Scientists have had long-held scientific beliefs that turned out not to be true. For a long time, it was a scientific fact that if you left meat out, it would turn into flies. Now that seems ridiculous to us now, but it was scientific knowledge for a long, long time. And if the Bible said that that was not the case, then someone like Dawkins, at the time, would have said, well, this proves that the Bible is unscientific and cannot be trusted. But science is constantly changing, and we learn that things that we held so confidently are not true. So am I saying that we cannot believe any science because it may turn out to be wrong? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you have to determine that the Bible is the Word of God based on other reasons. And if you determine that it is, then you must let it correct your beliefs about science. But even if we're just talking about scientists commenting on religion, I'm still not sure if Dawkins has thought through the full implications of this. He seems to be assuming that scientists will always be contradicting religion. But what if someone studies the scientific evidence and determines that it points towards the truth of Christianity? Now Dawkins would say that this would never happen. In fact, not only would he say that, he does say that in this section. He says, "NOMA is popular only because there is no evidence to favor the God hypothesis. The moment there is the smallest suggestion of any evidence in favor of religious belief, religious apologists would lose no time in throwing NOMA out of the window." Well, imagine this is NOMA. Science does point us to God. For most of history, scientists have believed generally that the universe has always existed. It was only in the 20th century when scientists finally realized that the universe has a beginning, This was a mind-blowing revolution in scientific thought. But they could have saved themselves a lot of time if they had just read their Bibles. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God literally put it on the first page. It shouldn't have been that hard. Now, when Dawkins was confronted about this by John Lennox, he said that it wasn't very impressive because there are only two options: the universe had a beginning, or it did not. He compared it to a coin flip. But this is confusing possibilities and probabilities, which is very strange because Dawkins criticizes that throughout this section. He presumably wouldn't say that if someone predicted that the flying spaghetti monster was going to show up, and it did, that it wasn't very impressive because either the flying spaghetti monster was going to show up or it wasn't. The Bible went against what was the scientific consensus for millennia, and turned out to be right. It makes sense for scientists to say, well, maybe this Bible book deserves a second look. And this leads to another issue. If scientists can comment on religion, then can they do that in a public school classroom? And it appears that Dawkins' answer would be that you can, as long as you're criticizing religion. But if you're affirming religion, then that's child abuse, and you cannot do that. But of course you can't have it both ways. If religion is a matter of science, then answering a science question in a science class cannot be child abuse, no matter which way you answer. But I'm going to go a step further. Science needs God. You cannot have science without God. Now that I'm sure is controversial. Why do I say that? Because science requires laws, and laws require a lawgiver. Now that's not word games. The universe functions in an orderly, consistent fashion. The laws of physics exist. They exist today, they existed yesterday, and we expect them to exist tomorrow. But why do we expect that? What possible rational justification do we have for expecting the future to be like the past? David Hume, an atheist, says we have no justification for that. If we say that the future has always been like the past in the past, that's circular reasoning. And yet science cannot work unless that is so. There's a reason why science developed in Christian countries and not in other countries. Christianity taught its followers to expect something that the followers of other worldviews were not taught to expect. They expected that the universe would be orderly, and it turned out it was. So perhaps it is a one-way street, but the other way. Dawkins is right. A universe with a creative superintendent would be a very different universe from one without. But science relies on us being in a universe with a creative superintendent. So in fact, it is impossible for science to refute God, because without God, there can't be science. So that is Dawkins' main argument in this section. He's right, but he doesn't really realize which side he's helping. But anyone who's read this book knows that Dawkins goes on a lot of tangents and side comments. And usually I try to avoid them. I usually try to focus on his main arguments, because if we try to comment on every single side comment or tangent he goes on, this wouldn't just be a 7-part series, it would be a 700-part series. But occasionally he makes an argument that is made so often that it's helpful to address it. So in the same section, Dawkins says, "To which chapter, then, of which book of the Bible should we turn? For they are far from unanimous, and some of them are odious by any reasonable standards. How many literalists have read enough of the Bible to know that the death penalty is prescribed for adultery, for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and for cheeking your parents?" Cheeking, by the way, means disobeying. So how many literalists know that? I honestly can't remember a time when I didn't know that. Now, I was raised in a church in a family that emphasized the Bible a lot more than a lot of other churches do. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of literalists that don't know that. But that's not an argument. You can't argue that because people don't know it, that means that it's not true. No, Dawkins' argument is that no one seriously looks to the Bible for moral guidance. Either people don't care enough to read it, or people who do read it pick and choose what to obey based on their own moral views. But Dawkins doesn't give another standard for morality. As I've said before, he will try to do that later in this book and he will fail. So from a secular worldview, you don't have to stone adulterers, but there's nothing wrong if you do. Now the fact is that it is perfectly just for God to command the stoning of sinners. The wages of sin is death. We exist to glorify God. If we are not glorifying God, then we have no reason to still be alive. And a just God has to punish sinners. That's why Jesus had to die and take God's wrath. You have sinned, and God will not hold his judgment. He will either judge Jesus or he will judge you. That is why you must trust in Jesus. or else you get a lot worse than the death penalty. But okay, if I'm saying these punishments are just, why am I not trying to enact them? Why am I not trying to find adulterers and Sabbath breakers and rebellious children and trying to get them killed? Now, what a lot of people don't understand about the books of Moses is that we call them the law, and we sometimes think, well, that's just a clever name for them. No, in fact, they actually were literal laws. It was the law for ancient Israel. And like all laws, they included penalties for breaking those laws. And some of them were the death penalty. Now, when it talks about the death penalty, that's not necessarily what would happen. It means the maximum punishment for it. But it could be the punishment for it. Well, none of us are living in ancient Israel, right? Even if someone is watching this in Israel, it's not ancient Israel. You have your own laws. This was a law code given by God for a nation that does not exist anymore. And so certainly the moral values taught in these books still apply. But the punishments come from a very specific context that none of us are in anymore. We don't apply the punishments for ancient Israel any more than we apply the punishments for 17th century France. Bottom line, these punishments are what we deserve, but God has given us grace. Now, there are two more quick quotes that I want to read from this book before I wrap up the video. One is Dawkins talking about creationists. I do have one thing in common with the creationists. Like me, but unlike the Chamberlain school, they will have no truck with Noma and its separate magisteria. Far from respecting the separateness of science's turf, creationists like nothing better than to trample their dirty hobnails all over it. This is true, we do not keep our hobnails very clean. Okay, that was just for fun, but seriously, his quote about prayer actually is accidentally profound. He quotes another atheist who defines to pray as, to ask that the laws of the universe be annulled on behalf of a single petitioner, confessedly unworthy. Now, this is of course slanted in a demeaning way, and not all prayers are about annulling the laws of the universe, but they are about the divine creator intervening in his universe. And the fact that he would do something like that for just some unworthy creature does sound ridiculous, but yet he does. Okay, so that's finally the end of Chapter 2. Only took all summer. I do like to thank those of you who have been watching my videos throughout the summer, whether you've watched all of them or this is the first one you've watched. And I do want to thank a certain viewer who has left very helpful comments on every one of my videos. But now that's finally done. I'm going to be going back to college in a few days, so I'm not going to be able to upload as many videos as I have. But hopefully I'll still be able to upload a few videos. My next video will not be on Chapter 3, or even on Richard Dawkins. I'll be trying to upload a video to address a more topical issue. We'll see when that gets up. Until then, thank you for watching, and like, share, and subscribe, like the slaves you are.